zu unserem Forschungskolloquium am Seminar Christlicher Orient Byzanz am Orientalischen Institut der Martin-Luther-Universität. Es ist uns eine sehr große Freude, dass wir heute Morgen Frau Dr. Ewa Balicka-Witakowska von der Uppsala University unter uns begrüßen dürfen. Sie wird uns einen Vortrag zum Thema The Syriac Story of the Magi and its Pictorial Versions präsentieren. Frau Balicka-Witakowska ist eine ausgewiesene Expertin im Bereich orientalisch-christliche Kunst mit einem starken Schwerpunkt auf äthiopischer Kunst, armenischer, syrischer, arabischer Kunst und darüber hinausgehend. Wir sind gespannt auf Ihren Beitrag.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here. And my presentation is about the Syriac story of the Magi and its pictorial versions. It is well known that the Christian iconography owes a lot to Syrian literature. A large number of original works having the biblical narrative for theme were composed by the Syrian writers. Widely spread in the Christian world and translated to many languages, they were incessantly consulted by the artists looking for the inspiration, especially when they wanted to illustrate the story growing outside the canonical text of the Old and New Testament. Limiting us to one narrative, namely the story of the Magi, we will attempt to show how the Christian imagery was created in connection to the apocryphal topics of Syrian origin. The choice of the subject is not incidental. On one side, the adoration of the Magi was one of the most popular pictorial narratives dealing with Jesus' infancy, probably due to appealing idea of superiority of Christ over all magic of the ancient world. On the other, it seems that the Syrians were particularly interested in Persian magicians and created most extensive narrative on the mysterious wise men. Widely spread in East and West, the stories were further developed according to local spiritual needs and preferences. The bulk of the story is recounted in the Gospel of Matthew and includes four main episodes. The Magi see a new star in the sky and follow it to Jerusalem. They ask King Herod about the newborn king. They arrive to Bethlehem and pay homage to Jesus and Mary. They return to their country by another way, warned about the evil plans of Herod. This relatively brief pericope could not quench the curiosity of the Gospel readers interested in details concerning the mysterious visitors. To meet the request of faithful, inventive writers began to fill up the lacunas left by the evangelist and to enlarge the plot of the story. On one hand, they provided the readers with information concerning the identity of the Magi, their number, age, and names. On the other, they invented how it turned out that the Magi came to Bethlehem, what happened to them after the visit, and so on and so on. The central event of the story, meeting with Jesus, was supplied with extra details as well. The most extensive composition is the anonymous work on the revelation of the Magi, known only from the Syriac chronicle of Pseudo-Dionysius of Telmache, written 775, but recapitulating the original composed in the 5th century. Devoted only to the story of the Magi, it's unique in the whole Christian apocryphal literature. Another legend is contained in the Apocryphon, The Cave of Treasures. In the present form, the work is composed in the 6th century, but it's based on early partly Jewish sources. The text, titled On the Star, from the period about 400, falsely attributed to Eusebius, tries to recount the story of the Magi in such a way that it appears as an historical event. The history of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which belongs to the apocryphal infancy Gospels, is known from a manuscript dated to the 13th century, but it contains many much older topics. More apocryphal episodes of the story of the Magi are to be found in the commentary to the Bible called Scholium, composed in the 8th century by Theodore Barconi, and in the historical works, the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian from 12th century, the chronography of the Gregory Bar Hebroio from the 13th century, and in the Book of B, written by Solomon, the East Syrian Metropolitan of Bosra. It was 13th century. One might expect that the prolific imagination of the Syrian writers responsible for so many works about the wise men found its counterpart in the creativity of Syrian artists. However, that is not the case. The Syrian representations now today, quite limited in number, depict exclusively the culmination of the story, that is, the arrival of the Magi to Bethlehem and the adoration. They follow two main iconographical types. The earliest type, which transports the idea that the wise men arrived to Bethlehem after the 2-day journey, 2 years journey, depicts them approaching the Virgin Mary, holding the child on her lap, as for instance we can see on the stone plaque from Rassam al-Kanafis, dated to the 6th century. It should be noticed that here the wise men are represented as the Persian magicians. Their costumes, composed of Phrygian caps, short tunics, and chlamyses, can effectively be compared with the clothes of Zoroastrian priests depicted in the Mitreum at Dura Europos. His type appears much later in the miniature of a lectionary dated to the 13th century. The second iconographical type illustrates the most popular tradition according to which the Magi reached Bethlehem some days after the birth of Christ and consequently shows their arrival as a part of the nativity scene. The Magi, characterized as kings wearing the costume crowns, approach the cave guided by the star or by an angel. This type belonging to the Byzantine imagery and was adopted by the Syrian painters. We find it, for instance, in another Syrian lectionary dated to the 13th century, or in the wall painting from the same period in the Suriani monastery. Both iconographical formulas mentioned above show 3 wise men, the number based on the number of the gifts which they brought to Jesus according to Matthew. However, since the evangelist never said expressis verbis what many they were, the other idea appeared as well. In some representation, there are 2 or 4. The Cave of Treasures tells about 3 wise men, but according to Pseudo-Dionysian's story, they were 12 in number. In the history of the Virgin Mary, it is said that the 3 kings with 9 men arrived to Bethlehem, which is clearly an attempt to combine the 2 traditions. In a letter of Jacob of Edessa, he died 708, we find information about the Magi, particularly important for the history of iconography. He wrote, I quote, "The Magi were not just 3, as the painter with the colors show people, having heard about the 3 gifts, but 12, as the additional written stories tell. The opinion of Jacob is quoted by Michael the Syrian and Bar Ebroyo. Also Solomon of Bosra, in his book of the Bee, writes about the 12 Magi, whom he divides into 3 groups of 4 according to the 3 kinds of gifts. 12 Magi appear also in Syrian pictorial tradition. We find them in Syrian Gospel book, dated to the end of the 15th century, as the illustration to Matthew pericope. I quote, "The star they, the Magi, had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was." The star itself is also depicted. It has decorative form and also serves as a frame for the character Beth, that is number 2, referring to the second choir of the manuscript and perhaps also to the 2nd chapter of Matthew. The second example, which shows 12 wise men, is a colored drawing added to a Syriac Gospel book written in 98. A very long inscription written around the picture contains 2 quotations from the 2nd chapter of Matthew and a short poem on 12 Magi bringing the gifts. The tradition of the 12 Magi is followed by the group of texts which either were translated from Syriac, as the Armenian and Arabic Gospel of Infancy, or influenced by the Syriac literary tradition, as the Ethiopic miracles of Jesus. However, the depiction of 12 Magi appears only in already mentioned Syriac manuscripts. Looking for more illustration of the apocryphal story of the Magi and to present them in a chronological order, we have to return to the already mentioned Arabic apocryphal Gospel of John, written in the 9th century. I have to apologize for this picture, but it's only one existing, very bad, but still giving some general picture about what it represents. It shows Zoroaster announcing his prophecy on the birth of Jesus to the tribe of the Magi. In the Syrian literature, the topic is present in Bar Ebroyo Bible commentary, Storehouse of the Mysteries, where Zoroaster is called the prophet of the Magi. Theodor Barkoni in his Scholion and Solomon of Basra in the Book of the Bee quote the whole of the Zoroaster's prophecy about Christ revealed to his disciple at the spring of Glosha. Pseudo-Eusebius on the star, and the Chronicle of Michael the Syrian and the chronography of Bar Ebroyo associate the Magi with another pagan prophecy. According to this text, when the wise men noticed a new star in the sky, they consulted their learned books and found there the word of Balaam. I quote, "There shall arise a star of Jacob, and a man shall rise up out of Israel." Balaam was quite often depicted in early Christian art, usually accompanying the nativity scene, or for instance in the wall painting in the Rome catacomb of Priscilla, or accompanying into the adoration of the Magi, as for instance on the sarcophagus from Tranquetae. In connection to the prophecies about Jesus' birth, 2 more legends should be mentioned. They are included to the homily on the Nativity, written in Greek in 8th century. Ascribed traditionally to John of Damascus, it shares ultimate origin with Syrian sources. The text is an elaborate account of the Magi, excerpted from a large anonymous 5th century romance known as the Religious Disputation at the Sasanian Court. The work became a part of two extensively illustrated manuscripts from the 12th century, one preserved in Jerusalem, known as Tafu 14, and another in Athos, in the monastery Sphimenu, also number 14. In the first tale, the consulting of various oracles took place at the Castilian spring. In the second, in the Persian capital, at the shrine of Hira. As said, both stories do not have a direct relation to the Syrian legends, but it seems that the author knew Syrian literary tradition on the Magi, which started with a prophecy. The same idea is perhaps reflected in the scene of the adoration in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, where an anonymous Sibylla appears, commonly interpreted as the symbol of heathen paying homage to Christ. According to pseudo-Dionysian story of the Magi, the wise men, following the commandments of their forefathers, used to climb the mountain of the splendors on 25th every month, and after the ritual ablutions in the spring of purification, they prayed awaiting the star. When it finally appeared, they, I quote, became overwhelmed with fear, fell on their knees, raised their arms, and in silence praised the miraculous sight. After that, they experienced a vision in the cave in which Christ appeared as a polymorphos. Descending the mountain, they received further revelations. The golden medallion from Adana, dated to 5th century, depicts in the lower register a kneeling person in a mountainous landscape and a star in the sky. Nearby, another figure, inclined on a stick, raises his hand, and in the middle of the field the inscription, "Behold Basileus," is discernible. Since the next scene represents the Magi bringing gifts, we can surmise that the previous two also belongs to the same story and represent Magus praying to the star and giving explanation of the mysterious sign. It's not a very clear picture, but it's overblown perhaps. Surprisingly, the same event returns in the altarpiece dated to the middle of the 15th century, the work of follower of the famous Netherlandish painter Rogier van der Weyden. We can see the Magi doing the ritual ablution before they discovered the sign in the heaven. It is amazing to realize how long and far some topics can travel. In that case, from 6th century Syria to the 15th century Netherlands. Without going into the details, I can just mention here the most important intermediary links, namely the Latin work Opus Imperfectum in Matthew, used by Beda Venerabilis in his homily on the Epiphany, which was known by Jacob de Voragine when he wrote his Speculum Salvationis Humanae, and also by John of Hildesheim when he composed Die Legende der Heiligen Drei Könige. Another version of the revelation of the Magi, related for instance in the history of the Virgin Mary, omits the version in the cave. It tells that when the marvelous star appeared in Persia, a great commotion followed in the country. The Magi, known for their efficiency in spells and divinations, were ordered to explain the astral phenomenon. They consulted all magical means known to them, but found their powers impotent. Just such a moment represents represents the 6th century relief in the Ciborium of San Marco in Venice, to be a copy of a Syriac work. The first scene shows 3 wise men, one looking at the sphere, the second reading a scroll, and the third observing the sky. The wall painting in the Cappadocian church Tokalikilise depicts the same moment. 3 Magi observe the sky holding a big unfolded scroll. In all Syrian legends on the Magi, the star plays a very important role, and we can observe a great variety in the way the phenomenon is recorded. The text on the star gives it an astral form, but points its great size and intensive light. The artist, wishing to show the unusual aspect of the star, used to give it large dimensions and decorative form, or change it into a comet by adding a long luminous tail, as for instance the Epitrachilion from Stavronikita Monastery, dated to the 16th century. Other literary sources give more complicated image of the star. The revelation of the Magi is not consequent in this narrative. According to it, the Magi, when climbing up the Mount of Splendors, discovered a column of light and then a star shining so brightly that it darkened the sun. The column of light appeared also in the front of the cave, which itself emitted light. It took a form of a little and low man who spoke with the Magi and called himself the star. Later on, the wise men began their journey. When they began their journey to Jerusalem, they could see the star and called it the messenger. It glared so intensively they needed neither the sun nor moon. Moreover, the star messenger supplied them with food, arranged resting places, led them safely across the rivers, and defended from wild animals. It took again the form of a column in the front of the Bethlehem grotto. Jesus explained to the Magi that it was he who acted as the guide. It's clear that such a complicated narrative was difficult to illustrate, and it's not surprising that not find it fully developed in pictorial form. The closest visual realization was painted in the workshop of already mentioned Rogier van der Weyden. In the mentioned altarpiece from the workshop, his workshop, and in another one presently in Berlin, both depicting the vision of the Magi at the Holy Mountain, the painter represented a shining star with a baby boy inside. The author of the Cave of Treasures brings different information about the star, saying, I quote, 2 years before Messias was born, a star appeared to the Magi. In it, there was a young girl carrying a child in her bosom. The tale was picked up by the author of the Armenian and Georgian Infancy Gospels and illustrated by the Armenian painters. For instance, the Nativity miniature in the 15th century Menologion shows the Virgin Mary with Jesus on her lap sitting in a deep cave, and the picture of them in a big round star above. The same idea of the star reached Ethiopia. In the apocryphal Miracles of Jesus, is said that, I quote, the light of the guiding star was like a column from heaven down to earth, and in the middle of the star there was an image of a virgin carrying a shining child. This narrative also inspired the Ethiopian painters, and from the early 18th century, the star with Mary and Jesus inside became a standard element of the adoration scene. The mysterious shining messenger who guided the wise men was also associated with an angel. This interpretation particularly appealed to the Byzantine artists. In the fresco of the main church in Meteora monastery, the angel acts as a Magi's guide and protector, and is represented on the horseback and with raised sword. An Ethiopian artist expressed the same idea differently. He depicted an over-dimensioned angel who covers with his wings the Magi and the Virgin Mary with the child. Some Syrian sources speak of the angel in the star. The history of the Virgin Mary calls him Ida, a watcher. Although this variant inspired the artist, and a Cretan icon from the 17th century shows an angel in half figure depicted in the middle of a radiant star. The problem which concerns the curious reader of the wise men's story was how they traveled to Bethlehem. And since the written sources seldom give some hints in this matter, the fantasy of the artist flourished. In the old representation, they travel on foot or riding the camels or horses. Later on, when they were conceived not only as the Oriental sages, but also as the great kings, the artists surrounded them with courtiers, guards, servants, and even musicians. The latter topic was developed in the Armenian Infancy Gospel, but it was an Ethiopian suite of the miniatures. They made a really picturesque story of this occurrence. The three kings, I show here just one of them, are represented as the Ethiopian rulers, accompanied by the courtiers, one of the highest in rank in the bearer of the royal umbrella, and surrounded by the armed guards who form a screen of their garments in order to make the king invisible for people and protect him from the malicious looks. The king is preceded by a group of musicians playing various instruments, among others the large drums used to announce the ruler's arrival or public reading of his orders. The illustration of the next episode, the arrival of the Magi to Jerusalem, meeting with Herod and Jewish sages, usually follows the canonical account, as for instance in the mosaic in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, or in the apocryphal Gospel of John. However, the miniatures of the Sphygmenu manuscript depict even less important moments of this event and show the Magi conversing with the Jews and discussion between the Jewish priests about the mysterious travelers. The most graphic story is related in the Armenian Infancy Gospel and tells about the conflict between Herod and the Magi. According to this text, the king, after a long interrogation, arrested the wise men, suspecting them for hiding from him information about Jesus. An earthquake and death of his people under the ruins of the palace caused him to release the dangerous visitors. The illustration of this story can be found in Armenian Gospel book from the end of the 14th century. Looking from the left, we recognize the king behind enthroned the kings behind enthroned Herod. He hides his face in cloak, listening to the group of Jewish priests. To the right, 3 imprisoned Magi are sitting inside a building. Finally, we see them on the horseback crossing a river and looking at the walls of the city, which are falling apart. Another miniature, which may illustrate the same story but in an abbreviated form, belonged to a Coptic Gospel manuscript. The first group to the left represent 3 Jews consulting the codices and a scroll. The next show Herod, rendered as an Oriental ruler, who makes a gesture of dismiss towards the 3 Magi, who in a rush pass through a gate. Our interpretation of this miniature becomes more probable when we note that the next scene representing the Magi giving gift to Jesus contains an element which could be traced to the same apocryphal narrative. According to Matthew, the Magi offered to Jesus gold, incense, and myrrh. Very early theological explanations concerning the significance of the gifts were developed, and in the end of the 4th century, Ephraim the Syrian, in his commentary to the Diatessaron, was able to quote many opinions. The first he mentions became universally accepted, I quote, "Gold for his human nature, myrrh as a sign of his death, incense for his divine nature." The early iconographical tradition used to show all the Magi carrying the identical looking gifts, usually in the form of discs. In the mentioned Coptic Gospels, the Magi are carrying the basket covered with whales. However, Jesus is not empty-handed, but holds already a scroll in his hand. The Armenian Infant's Gospel brings the explanation of this iconography. We learn that among the gifts offered to Jesus, there was the Testament of Adam, containing revelations given to him by God. The Magi mentioned the testament to Herod, who wished to consult it, but was not allowed, because, I quote, "This book was sealed by the finger of God, and only by him could be opened." In Bethlehem, the oldest Magus delivered the testament of Jesus to Jesus and asked him to read it. It should be noted that the Coptic manuscript is not unique in depicting this event. In the 14th century Greek miniatures, which illustrate the Akatistos hymn, the same element is included to the miniature. The great part of the quoted text states that Magi, approaching Jesus' child, greeted him as sovereign, bowing down in oriental manner and acknowledging his superiority and his royal status by laying their crowns at the Jesus' feet. The illustration of this account are to be found in 3 miniatures: Byzantine, Syrian, and Ethiopic. The extensive miniature suite of the manuscript of Esphigmenou, illustrating the Pseudo-Damascenos homily on the Nativity, continues to report what happened later during the visit of the Magi in the Bethlehem grotto. We can see the Magi instructing a painter who intends to make a portrait of Mary and the child. In the Tafu 14, the portrait is already painted and the next picture shows its installation in a temple in Persia. The story of the portrait, as recounted by the Greek homily and depicted by the Greek artists, seems to be an original creation without any direct connection to the Syrian works. However, the topic itself was presented in the Syrian literature because it can be traced to the text based on the Syrian sources. For instance, in the Ethiopian Miracles of Mary, recounting that Balaam, who saw a virgin with a child on a star 1,520 years before the events in Bethlehem, painted his vision and gave the picture to his assistant Zoroaster. It was subsequently shown to every new generation of the Magi, and when the unusual star arose in the connection to Jesus' nativity, they compared it with the painting of Balaam and found to be the same. And Magi carried this painting with them to Bethlehem. The next episode of the legend of the Magi concerns the visions which the wise men experienced staying with Mary and Jesus in the cave of Nativity. The pseudo-Dionysius describes with verbiage typical for him two different events. First, Jesus revealed to the Magi the last judgment. The sight is so horrible that they fall unconscious and to the ground. The second vision, recounted already in the Cave of Treasures, is about the changeability of Jesus, being perceived in different way by each of the Magi. One of them saw a newborn child, another a boy, the third a humble man, the fourth a man hanging on a cross, the fifth a person descending to the limbo, the sixth a figure ascending to heaven, and the seventh a person in the heaven carried by seraphs, surrounded by singing angels, and crowned by the Parakletos. Polymorphism of Christ is also raised up in the pseudo-Damascenus homily on the Nativity. Here, however, the changes of Jesus correspond to his age rather than to the stage of the salvation mission. Consequently, the first of the Magi saw him as a baby, the second as a 30-year-old man, and the third as an old man. This version, which most probably became the further source of the iconography that represents the Magi as a men of different ages, was also literally illustrated. A mural in Cappadocian church Aegitas Kilisesi represents them standing each in front of the figure of Christ. The Magi are depicted in different ages, but so is Christ too. We can see old Malcolm facing an adult bird Christ, middle-aged Gaspar with a wrinkled face at the front of the mature Christ, and finally a young Balthazar looking at the child in a manger. The miniature of Tafo 14, which illustrates the passage relating to how Magi, seeing the infant Jesus playing in the cave, lifted him in their arms, show a very strange and abstract picture. In front of the Virgin Mary, the youngest Magus is carrying an old man looking at the God the Father. The middle-aged one is bearing a little figure of Christ represented as an adult, and the oldest is lifting the young Jesus depicted according to iconographical type known as Child Emmanuel. Several sources state that the wise men, before leaving for their country, received some gift from the Virgin Mary and Jesus. According to the history of the Virgin Mary and the Arabic infancy gospel, these were Jesus' wedding bands. The Arabic apocryphal Gospel of John and the Ethiopian miracles of Jesus tell about bread. We can also mention the Uyghur fragment of the legend where a corner of the stone manger is named. To all these objects, a story is connected describing the circumstances in which the miraculous qualities of the souvenirs appeared, often in the connection to the Zoroastrian festival, and how later these became highly venerated relics. In the pictorial tradition, only one of the gifts appears, namely the swaddling bands. A drawing in the Arabic Gospel of John shows two Magi presenting the bands to a group of their country fellows. The history of the Virgin Mary tells that at a religious festival in Persia, the bands were cast into the fire but was not burned. On the contrary, they became firmer and whiter. The Magi kissed them and put on their eyes. The gesture of the Magus, who points to his eyes, seems to allude to this episode. But putting the bands on the eyes, the Magi probably accomplished a kind of magic act which could give them more power or some extra strong protection. In fact, they were magicians who had acknowledged somebody whose magic was superior to their own, just as the passage in the history of the Virgin Mary puts it, I quote, "And the Magi said, in very true and beyond all doubt, this is a garment of the God of gods, for the fire of our gods was unable to consume it." Jesus' wedding bands are also depicted in a 15th century Armenian lectionary. In different form than this in Arabic Gospel, they float in the sky surrounded by the stars. The events which took place in connection with the Magi return to their country were largely treated in the most of the Syriac texts. They recount that wise men were guided and protected on their way home by the same messenger who led them to Bethlehem. Later, they were baptized by the Apostle Thomas, and that occasion experienced once again a vision of the shining boy. Of some reasons, this part of the legend was not very often illustrated. The Byzantine generally offers the return of the Magi as the illustration of the 10th stanza of the Akatistos hymn. We also find it in the extended pictorial suite of the Manuscripta 414, which shows them reading out of Bethlehem, still guided by an angel. More original was the author of the mosaic in San Marco in Venice, who decided to make the return an adventurous event and show the Magi traveling by boat. To sum up, going to the rich Christian, Oriental and Byzantine pictorial tradition concerning the Magi, which also match Syriac written sources, one can easily realize why just this subject was preferred more than the other narratives about the infancy of Jesus. The story, full of mysterious events, lent itself without difficulties to iconographic exposition. It offered to the image makers a large scale of possibilities, containing on one hand simple everyday scenes, easy to adaptable to the pictorial interpretation, and on the other complicated theophanic vision which challenged the imagination. The artists of the early Christian era and their successor in the Middle Ages willingly return to this multifaceted text, since no other open opportunities of making the sacred story both exciting and instructive. We note, however, that no artistic milieu produced a complete pictorial realization of the Magi story. We might suppose that the lack of extensive text which gathered all these colorful tales was one of the reasons. In the West, however, such compilations appear in the late Middle Ages, and the pictorial tradition went another way. But it is a different subject which falls outside of the scope of this presentation. Thank you.